My name is Sister Amara, and I was once filled with a hope so pure it felt like sunlight. I believed my life was meant to serve God, to honor His teachings, and to bring light into a dark world. But this sanctuary I imagined when I joined the convent was not what I found. Behind the holy walls, behind the sacred vows, and behind the whispered prayers, a darkness lurked, a darkness that lived in the hearts of those entrusted with our guidance. I was barely 19 when I walked through those gates. My family was poor but proud, devout but humble. The idea of serving God felt like my destiny. I pictured a life of prayer, service, and community. I imagined being surrounded by wisdom, love, and guidance. I thought that faith could be a shield, protecting me from the harshness of the world. I could not have been more wrong. From the very first days, the convent's walls felt like both a fortress and a prison. The nuns and clergy I met wore masks of holiness, but behind them I found control, cruelty, and corruption. The senior sisters demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience. Any hesitation, any simple question was met with threats, sometimes whispered, sometimes sharp and deliberate warning that the consequences of failure would be severe. The fear in that convent was a silent, suffocating thing, thick enough to choke your prayers. I learned the rules quickly. Always obey, even when obedience felt deeply wrong. Always smile, even when your heart was breaking. Always appear grateful, even when the food was scarce, the work was exhausting, and the moral decay around you was impossible to ignore. Those who questioned too loudly, those who faltered, those who dared to look too closely at the shadows, they just disappeared. They became silence, rumors, or something worse. And yet, through it all, I clung to my faith. I prayed every morning, every night, and in those quiet, pre-dawn hours when the world slept. I whispered to God, asking for guidance, for protection, for the courage to survive the dark days I knew were ahead. My prayers were honest, raw, and desperate. I didn't understand why such evil could fester in a place where His name was meant to shine, but I believed. I had to believe that God could see me, that He could hear my heart, and that He could guide me through the storm. The first real warning came just a few months in. A sister older, experienced, and feared by most approached me one evening. Her voice was calm, almost chilling. She said, "Sister Amara, obedience is everything. Curiosity, questions, hesitation, these are dangerous things here. Some do not survive their mistakes. You must remember that. We protect the convent, we protect each other, but we will not protect the foolish." I didn't fully understand what she meant then. All I understood was fear. The fear that I could be erased, silenced, or worse, if I ever stepped out of line. And the darkness only grew. I started to notice patterns. Certain priests held an unnerving control over the younger nuns. They demanded unquestioned loyalty, using their authority to mask a deep corruption. Some of the older, more influential nuns became their enforcers, punishing anyone who faltered with a particular cruelty. I began to witness secret punishments, whispered threats, and moments where the convent, this supposedly holy place, became a chamber of silent terror. Still, I held on to whatever little light I could find. The Mass, the hymns, the quiet moments of prayer, these became my sanctuary. Even when everything around me felt tainted and wrong, I would kneel and feel a small, fragile spark of hope. I'd whisper to God, "Please, show me the way. Help me survive this place. Help me hold on to you." I can't fully describe the fear that became my daily companion. There was a constant weight on my chest, a tight knot in my stomach, a whisper at the edge of my mind reminding me. One misstep, one question, one hesitation, and everything could be lost. But within that fear, I also found a new determination. I learned to endure. I learned to observe silently, to understand the patterns, to navigate the dangers without being seen. I learned the most important skill for survival, patience. Patience became my armor. I waited. I watched. I learned which battles were worth fighting and which ones required silence. I discovered the hidden corners of the convent where I could be truly alone, where I could pray freely, where I could just breathe without the shadow of eyes watching my every move. And in those quiet moments, I began to wrestle with the biggest question of my life. How could a place devoted to God harbor so much darkness? The more I saw, the more I questioned. At first it was small things. Why did Sister Mary scold the young novices so harshly? Why did Father Elias insist on rules that felt more cruel than holy? Why did so many secrets flourish behind locked doors? I asked God in my prayers, hoping for some understanding, for some insight, for a sliver of clarity. My faith felt like a fragile candle in a hurricane. I could see the light, but the wind threatened to snuff it out at any moment. I began keeping a record of what I observed, just in my head at first, and then in secret journals. Every injustice, every cruel word, every veiled threat was noted down. It was incredibly dangerous. If discovered, it would have been used against me, but I felt compelled to do it. I couldn't let my own conscience die under the weight of fear and silence. And then came the night that changed everything. It was unlike any night before. The shadows felt heavier, the air felt colder, the silence felt louder. I had been praying, kneeling alone in my small cell, pleading with God for guidance, for courage, for strength. Suddenly, a wave of imminent danger washed over me. I heard whispers of threats, movements in the halls, and I knew that powerful, corrupt men and women were planning something that could destroy me if I ever spoke out. For the first time, I understood the true scale of the corruption. I wasn't just surrounded by moral failure. I was surrounded by people who would actively harm me to protect it. I don't wish to recount all the horrors in detail, the fear, the coercion, the moral corruption. But I will say this. That night, for the very first time, I truly questioned everything. My faith, my vows, my entire purpose. I wondered if God had abandoned me. I wondered if the path I had chosen, the life I had devoted to Him, was worth all this pain. I felt lost, broken, and utterly alone. And yet, in that abyss of darkness, something completely unexpected happened. Amid the fear and despair, a warmth began to spread through me. It didn't come from the people around me, but from somewhere deep inside, from somewhere beyond the shadows. I can't fully explain it with human words, but I felt God's presence. Not in a thunderclap or a blinding light, but in a quiet, undeniable certainty that He had not left me. That even when the world seemed irredeemably corrupted and cruel, He was watching, guiding, and ready to intervene. In that moment, I made a choice. I could let fear consume me, or I could hold on to that spark of faith, however faint it was. I whispered a prayer, unlike any I had ever prayed before, one that was raw, desperate, and completely honest. God, if You are real, show me the way. Protect me. Give me the courage to survive and to live according to Your will. The warmth intensified. I felt an energy, a light, a presence that filled the room and my soul. And in that moment, the fear that had gripped me for years finally began to release its hold. I realized that survival required not only patience and cleverness, but also faith, a faith that could transcend fear, a faith that could believe in miracles, even when nothing else made any sense. By morning, I was changed. The circumstances around me were the same, the corruption, the threats, the evil, but I was changed in my heart. I understood that God had not abandoned me, that I could endure this, that I could navigate the darkness with Him as my guide. And I made a vow to myself that, no matter what came next, I would find a way to survive, to protect my spirit, and to honor my faith. And I made a vow to myself that, no matter what came next, I would find a way to survive, to protect my spirit, and to honor my faith. Life in the convent was a study in contrasts. The prayers and hymns that filled the halls each morning carried a veneer of holiness, but behind those walls, reality was far different. I learned quickly that this wasn't just a place of devotion. It was a place of power, control, and fear. Those in authority wielded their influence with cold precision. I began to understand the hierarchy. The senior nuns weren't simply guides or mentors, they were enforcers. They monitored our every move, measured our obedience, and rewarded conformity while punishing any hint of hesitation. Even the clergy, the men who had dedicated their lives to God, often operated above any moral standard. Decisions felt arbitrary, punishments were hidden but severe, and threats were ever present. Every day became a negotiation between survival and devotion. I had to memorize the subtle cues: when to speak, when to remain silent, when to nod, and when to hide my true thoughts. The convent was a minefield, and a single misstep could have consequences far beyond embarrassment. Rumors of nuns who had disappeared, been reassigned, or disciplined for small mistakes were whispered but never fully explained. The threat of death, whether literal, spiritual, or a destruction of your reputation, hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. And yet, amid the fear, I was deeply committed to God. My prayers were my lifeline. I prayed not only for myself, but for the strength to endure the darkness around me, for the wisdom to navigate it, and for the courage to survive without losing my soul. In secret, I started journaling my thoughts and observations, chronicling the injustices I witnessed and the small moments of kindness that reminded me there was still goodness in the world. The challenges were constant. I watched older nuns manipulate younger ones, punishing them for perceived failures or questioning their faith. I witnessed clergy issuing harsh orders that made no spiritual sense but consolidated their control. I saw favoritism, secrecy, and deception flourish, all in the name of preserving the convent's holy image. The corruption was systemic, and it was terrifyingly effective. Those who resisted or spoke up were silenced. Those who obeyed blindly were rewarded with minor privileges, just enough to keep them compliant. At first, I tried to confront my fear with optimism. I reminded myself that God could guide me, that I could find a way to survive while staying true to my vows. But as the months turned into years, the weight of oppression began to crush that fragile spark of hope inside me. I felt a profound loneliness. I couldn't fully confide in anyone. Trust was dangerous. Every conversation was layered with caution, every friendship tested by the fear that the wrong person might report your thoughts to those in power. There were moments that cut deeper than any punishment. I remember one morning during early Mass, seeing a young novice trembling as a senior sister berated her for some imagined failure. The novice's face was pale, her hands shaking, her eyes wide with terror. I recognized that same fear in myself. I wanted so badly to speak up, to comfort her, but I knew that showing sympathy could mark me as weak or worse, a target. That day, I realized that survival sometimes meant silencing even your deepest compassion. To cope, I developed strategies. I observed, I memorized, I became skilled at reading moods, predicting reactions, and calculating risks. I learned to smile even when my heart ached. I learned to nod, to agree, to participate in the rituals of obedience without losing myself completely. I created secret spaces in my mind sanctuaries where I could pray, dream, and imagine a life beyond the walls of the convent. In these hidden places, God felt close, and I felt alive. The moral corruption around me was constant and unnerving. Senior figures manipulated novices emotionally and spiritually, bending our faith to their will. Sometimes it took the form of favoritism, subtle threats, or cruel punishment for minor errors. Other times it was psychological isolation, humiliation, the erasure of identity under the guise of discipline. The convent, which was supposed to be a place of safety and holiness, became a labyrinth of fear and moral compromise. But even in that darkness, there were small lights. A kind word from an older nun who had quietly protected me. A moment of solidarity with another novice. A stolen hour in the chapel praying freely. These moments reminded me that faith was still possible, that God's presence was still real, and that I could endure without being consumed entirely by despair. The nights were the hardest. Alone in my small cell, the silence became oppressive, filled with imagined threats and memories of the day's injustices. I prayed constantly, whispering desperate pleas for strength and protection. I often lay awake, heart pounding, trying to reconcile my faith with the cruelty I witnessed. It was during these nights that I began to question everything: the convent, the clergy, my vows, and even God himself. I asked, why does darkness hide behind holy names? Why does power corrupt those who are meant to guide? Where is justice? Despite the fear, I found moments of quiet rebellion, small acts of courage that kept my spirit alive. I spoke the truth silently to God, writing in hidden journals that no one could find. I offered silent prayers for those who were suffering. I practiced kindness in secret, comforting younger novices when I could without attracting attention. These small acts became lifelines, reminders that morality and faith were not entirely lost within the convent walls. The years passed slowly. Every day brought new challenges, new tests of obedience, new confrontations with fear. The corruption was pervasive, the threats constant, and the moral compromises endless. Yet, through it all, I clung to my faith in God, though it was fragile, battered, and full of questions. And then, one night unlike any other, I faced the greatest test of my life. It was a night where the shadows were thick, the air heavy with menace, and the weight of secrecy and oppression pressed down like a physical force. The corrupt figures in the convent, both men and women, orchestrated a situation that left me cornered, fearful for my life and questioning everything I had ever believed. I realized in that moment that the convent, the walls, and even the prayers could not protect me from the evil that lurked behind holy facades. I understood that if I did not navigate this night carefully, I could lose everything: my safety, my spirit, my life. That night tested not only my courage, but my faith itself. I was forced to confront the darkness directly, to face my deepest fears, and to decide whether to surrender entirely or to hold on to the small spark of belief I still carried. The fear was overwhelming, yet in that moment, a quiet voice inside me, a voice I could not ignore, reminded me that God was present, that miracles were possible, and that even the darkest night could be transformed. By dawn, I was changed. The fear didn't vanish, the corruption didn't disappear, and the convent remained as it always had been, but something inside me had shifted. I realized that survival required not only cleverness and caution, but a faith that transcended fear, courage that defied despair, and the ability to trust in God's unseen hand. And I vowed, in that quiet dawn, that I would endure. I would protect my soul, and I would hold on to hope, no matter what darkness lay ahead. By dawn, I was changed. The fear didn't vanish, the corruption didn't disappear, and the convent remained as it always had been, but something inside me had shifted. I realized that survival required not only cleverness and caution, but a faith that transcended fear, courage that defied despair, and the ability to trust in God's unseen hand. And I vowed, in that quiet dawn, that I would endure. I would protect my soul, and I would hold on to hope, no matter what darkness lay ahead. The night came suddenly, though I had felt its shadow approaching for months. The air in the convent felt different, heavier, as if every brick and every whispered secret had conspired to trap me. I could hear the silence pressing against my ears, the echo of my own heartbeat in the dark. For weeks, I had sensed a plan unfolding, threats and manipulation, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. I remember kneeling in my cell, praying as I always did, seeking strength from God. My hands were folded tightly, my lips moving silently, whispering every desperate plea I could summon. God, protect me. God, give me courage. God, show me the way. I had faced fear before, but this was different. This was a direct confrontation with the forces of corruption, with those who would use their power to control and dominate anyone who did not comply. The footsteps came first, not one, but many. I counted them, 12 distinct steps moving with purpose, echoing through the stone corridors. 12 figures, men and women alike, cloaked in the authority of the convent, yet radiating something far darker. The very air seemed to vibrate with menace. They had chosen me, singled me out, and the weight of that realization was like a knife pressed to my chest. I tried to stand, to hide, to flee, but the doors and hallways seemed unfamiliar, twisted by fear. Every escape I had mapped in my mind evaporated. And then I felt their presence close around me, a suffocating pressure, a sense of being trapped by the very people I had once trusted. It was in that moment that the fear became almost physical. My mind raced. If I resist, I could be killed. If I comply, I betray myself. If I speak, no one would believe me. God, what do I do? The night stretched on, minutes feeling like hours. I realized then that the convent's corruption was not just moral, but systemic, methodical, and terrifyingly efficient. These 12 individuals represented a reality I had only glimpsed before, a world where obedience was demanded at the cost of safety. where silence was enforced with threats and where power corrupted absolutely. I could feel my face teetering on a knife's edge. But as the night deepened, a strange, almost imperceptible calm began to settle over me. Not because the danger had lessened, it had not, but because I felt, somehow, the presence of something greater. I could not see it, could not touch it, but I knew it was there. A warmth, a light, a quiet certainty that whispered to the deepest part of my soul, "Do not fear. You are not alone." In that moment, I realized the truth I had avoided for years. Faith is not about the absence of fear. It is about trusting God in the presence of it. I understood that courage was not the absence of danger, but the willingness to stand in the shadow of it, relying not on human strength but on divine guidance. Then, something extraordinary happened. I closed my eyes and whispered a single prayer, more desperate and raw than any before. "God, if you are here, show me, protect me, save me." And as I prayed, the fear that had clawed at my chest began to recede, replaced by a warmth that spread from my heart outward. It was not the absence of danger, but a presence so powerful, so undeniable, that I knew in that instant that God was with me. The 12 figures moved closer, their intentions clear, their authority absolute. And yet, despite their menace, I felt a strange peace. I did not understand how, but I knew that I would survive. I knew that my life, my spirit, was being protected in a way that no human force could touch. I felt as if invisible hands lifted me, as if a shield of divine energy surrounded me, preventing any harm from reaching my body or my soul. Time seemed to stretch and warp. The oppressive atmosphere, the fear, the threat, all of it collided in a single moment. And then, a miracle. I cannot explain it logically, cannot describe it fully in words, but the sensation was as real as the stone beneath my knees. A light, a presence, a force that filled the room with warmth, safety, and undeniable power. In that instant, the 12 figures faltered. Their authority, which had seemed absolute, wavered. Their control, which had seemed inescapable, broke. I was free, not because of human intervention, but because something far greater had acted on my behalf. I opened my eyes, and the room seemed transformed. The shadows that had loomed so heavily just moments before seemed to retreat, and the fear that had gripped me for years lifted like a fog. I felt a profound sense of peace, a clarity I had never known. I understood with certainty that God had intervened, that He had protected me, and that my faith, my fragile, battered, but unbroken faith was restored. That night was a turning point. The convent remained corrupt, the threats, the oppression, and the moral decay continued. But I had been changed. I had witnessed divine power, a force beyond human comprehension, a miracle that saved not just my body, but my spirit. I realized that faith is not a shield against suffering, but a lifeline through it, a source of strength that cannot be extinguished by the darkness of others. In the days that followed, I began to rebuild myself from the inside out. I continued my duties, still careful, still navigating the dangers of the convent. But I was no longer paralyzed by fear. I carried with me the certainty of divine protection, the knowledge that even in the darkest circumstances, God's presence is undeniable and that miracles can happen when we least expect them. The pivotal moment of that night became a compass for my life. I began to see the world differently, to understand my purpose with greater clarity, and to hold my faith with a depth I had never imagined. I realized that survival is not merely physical. It is spiritual, moral, and emotional. And I vowed that no matter the darkness around me, I would not allow it to corrupt my soul, nor would I lose sight of God's light. From that night onward, I began to write openly in my secret journals, chronicling not only the corruption and oppression I endured, but also the miraculous intervention that restored me. I began to pray not only for myself, but for those who were trapped in similar darkness, for those whose lives were shadowed by fear, for those whose faith had been shaken by the cruelty of others. This moment was more than survival, it was revelation. I understood that God's power is real, that faith can be restored even after despair, and that even the most oppressive situations cannot extinguish the spark of divine protection. I learned that miracles often arrive when human hope has been exhausted, when fear is at its peak, and when we are most in need of guidance. And so, though the convent remained a place of corruption, I emerged from that night transformed. I was no longer a novice trembling in the shadows. I was a nun with a renewed sense of purpose, clarity, and faith. I had faced the darkness, and I had not only survived, but had been touched by the divine. And in that touch, I found a courage, a resilience, and a conviction that would guide me for the rest of my life. The days after that pivotal night were unlike any I had ever experienced. The convent, with all its cold corridors, whispered threats, and hidden cruelty, seemed unchanged to the casual observer. Yet I knew the truth. I had changed. The darkness I had feared for so long no longer controlled me. The divine presence I had felt, tangible and undeniable, had shifted something deep within me. I understood now that faith is not a passive shield against suffering. It is an active living force that guides, protects, and restores. I began to observe the convent with new eyes. I still saw the corruption, the fear, and the manipulation. I saw the senior nuns exerting control over novices, the clergy bending their authority toward selfish ends, the oppressive rules enforced through intimidation. But I no longer felt powerless. I realized that my strength did not come from avoiding confrontation or hiding in silence. It came from knowing that God's presence was with me and that my spirit could not be broken. From that night onward, I approached my life with deliberate intention. I studied the patterns of those in power, learning how to navigate their cruelty without compromising my principles. I discovered that courage is not recklessness. It is a careful, deliberate act of choosing what must be done, even when danger looms. I learned to protect myself not by retreating entirely, but by understanding the rules of engagement, the hidden threats, and the subtle manipulations that govern the lives of those around me. I also began to see the importance of quiet compassion. I could not openly confront the corruption. It was too dangerous, but I could offer support, guidance, and encouragement to the younger novices who were trapped in fear. I became a silent protector, a quiet voice of hope for those who were too afraid to speak. Through small acts of kindness, I reminded others that faith, goodness, and courage were still possible, even in the darkest circumstances. Perhaps the greatest lesson I learned was the power of prayer and trust. Before that night, I prayed out of habit, out of obligation, or out of desperate fear. But after the miracle, I prayed with understanding and purpose. I realized that God's guidance is not always obvious, that His protection may not arrive in the form we expect, and that miracles often work in subtle ways that human eyes cannot perceive. My faith became active, living, and unshakable, even when circumstances seemed hopeless. I also began to write more openly in my secret journals. I documented not only the oppression, fear, and corruption, but also the moments of courage, divine guidance, and resilience. I chronicled the ways I navigated danger, protected my spirit, and helped others endure. These writings became a lifeline, a reminder that even in silence and secrecy, one could witness, record, and honor the truth. They were also a source of strength, showing me that survival was not simply about enduring, but about maintaining integrity, faith, and hope. In practical terms, I developed a set of strategies for surviving the convent while remaining true to my principles. First was observation. I watched carefully, noting patterns, alliances, and threats. Knowledge became my shield. Then came patience. I learned to wait for the right moment, to act when timing was on my side, and to avoid unnecessary risks. I practiced selective trust, choosing carefully whom to confide in, offering support only to those whose hearts were pure. I also created an inner sanctuary, mental and spiritual spaces where I could pray, reflect, and find strength away from the fear. And most importantly, I developed an active faith. I practiced prayer, meditation, and spiritual reflection not as routine, but as a conscious connection with God's guidance. Through these strategies, I discovered that survival and faith are intertwined. One cannot endure true darkness without both clarity and trust. I realized that the convent, despite its oppression, could not dictate the inner life of my soul. No one could touch my prayers, my thoughts, or my devotion, and that became my greatest strength. I also began to see a broader lesson in suffering and resilience. Life often places us in circumstances beyond our control, governed by those who wield power unjustly. Yet, it is in these moments that character is forged, faith is tested, and courage is revealed. I understood that God allows hardship not to punish, but to shape, strengthen, and prepare us for greater purpose. Through reflection, I saw that my journey was not only about survival, but about witness. By enduring, I could serve as an example to others, showing that even in places of corruption, cruelty, and fear, hope and faith are possible. I could demonstrate that divine intervention is real, that miracles are not merely stories, but living, breathing experiences, and that the human spirit, guided by faith, is resilient beyond measure. I also learned the importance of humility and forgiveness. Though the convent had harmed me, I understood that anger and bitterness would not heal or protect my soul. Instead, I focused on compassion, empathy, and moral clarity. I did not condone the corruption I witnessed, but I chose to rise above it to maintain my own integrity and to hold fast to God's light. With this clarity, I began to mentor younger novices, guiding them through the same trials I had endured. I shared lessons subtly, helping them recognize danger, maintain inner strength, and find moments of peace. I became a quiet force of change, not by challenging the system openly, which would have been perilous, but by nurturing courage, wisdom, and faith in those around me. And always, I returned to prayer. Each night, each day, I sought God's presence not as an escape from fear, but as a source of power and understanding. I learned to listen, to trust, and to act in accordance with divine guidance. The miracle I had experienced was no longer a single moment in time. It became a living reality, a source of ongoing strength and reassurance. By the time I reached the midpoint of my convent life, I had transformed from a frightened novice into a woman of courage, clarity, and purpose. I no longer feared the shadows, the threats, or the corrupt authority around me. I had learned that true protection comes not from walls, rules, or obedience, but from faith, inner strength, and the unwavering belief that God's presence is constant. Months passed after that fateful night, yet the memory of it lingered in my mind like a shadow I could never fully shake. I continued my duties, walking the halls with careful steps, speaking words of kindness when I could, and praying constantly. The convent remained the same on the surface, cruel, oppressive, and secretive, but within me, something had shifted irreversibly. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky with fiery shades of orange and red, I found myself in the chapel alone. The room was quiet, the candles flickering softly, casting dancing shadows across the stone walls. I knelt, as I had done countless times before, and prayed with every ounce of my being. I didn't pray for safety, not for deliverance from others, but for clarity, for courage, and for the restoration of my faith in a world that had tested it to its breaking point. Suddenly, I felt a warmth on my skin, gentle but insistent, as if invisible hands were guiding me, surrounding me with light and protection. I opened my eyes, but there was nothing extraordinary to see, no glowing figures, no angels in sight. Yet the sensation was undeniable. It filled my chest, lifted the weight from my shoulders, and illuminated the darkest corners of my heart. I felt a peace like I had never known, a certainty that God's presence was real, immediate, and infinite. In that moment, I understood something profound. Miracles are not always visible, but they are always felt. God's protection had been with me all along, even during the nights of fear and oppression, even when my heart wavered with doubt. The miracle was not only my survival, but the restoration of my spirit, the reawakening of hope, and the reaffirmation of a faith that transcends human cruelty. As I sat there, I felt an urge to rise and walk through the convent halls. I did so slowly, deliberately, fully aware of the risks, yet unafraid. Something inside me had shifted so profoundly that the threats no longer held sway over my soul. I passed the same corridors that had once filled me with terror, the same doors behind which secrets and cruelty thrived, and I realized that nothing in the physical world could touch the fortress that faith had built inside me. That night, I also realized the importance of sharing my experience, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a testament to resilience, faith, and divine intervention. I began writing more openly in my journals, recounting every detail of my journey, the fear, the oppression, the darkness, but most importantly, the miracle that restored my life and faith. These writings became a source of strength, not only for myself, but for anyone who might one day read them. In the following weeks, small changes began to appear in me. I felt more confident in my duties, more compassionate toward the younger novices, and more determined to maintain my moral integrity despite the corruption around me. I began to mentor others subtly, teaching them how to navigate the dangers of the convent, how to protect their spirit, and how to hold fast to their faith. My presence became a quiet light, a living testament to the possibility of divine protection and moral resilience. One morning, as I walked through the garden, I paused to look at the first blooms of spring. I marveled at the way the sunlight fell upon the petals, the way the wind whispered through the trees, and I felt gratitude unlike any I had known. I realized that my journey had been as much about discovering God's presence in ordinary moments as it had been about surviving extraordinary danger. Faith, I understood, is not only revealed in miracles, but also nurtured in the simple, sacred details of life. I also understood forgiveness. Not the kind that condones wrongdoing, but the kind that frees the spirit. I forgave those who had harmed me, not for their sake, but for mine. I released the anger, the resentment, and the bitterness, understanding that they would only weigh me down and prevent me from embracing the life God intended for me. I forgave to reclaim my soul and to live fully in the light of divine guidance. The final, undeniable miracle of my life was not an explosion of spectacle, but a quiet transformation. I had survived the cruelty, witnessed corruption, endured fear, and faced the very edge of despair. And yet, through it all, I had emerged whole, spiritually fortified, and deeply aware of God's presence. My faith, once fragile and tested, had become unshakable. My spirit, once trembling, now radiated strength. My life, once dictated by fear, was now guided by divine purpose. As I continue my journey, I remain vigilant, aware of the dangers and challenges that surround me. But I no longer live in fear. I live in faith, hope, and purpose. I guide, I protect, and I witness to the power of God's love. And I know, without a doubt, that the miracle that saved me that night is a gift for all who believe, endure, and trust in His infinite wisdom and mercy. The story of my life, of my struggles, and of my miraculous restoration is a testament to every soul who has faced oppression, cruelty, or fear. It is a reminder that even in the most desperate moments, God's hand is present. It is a call to endurance, courage, and unwavering faith. And it is proof that miracles are not only possible, they are real, transformative, and life-saving. Before the world knew her name, before she learned how to choose her own direction, her life was shaped by walls. Stone walls rising high and firm around the convent, holding prayer inside and keeping the outside world far away. They were meant to protect holiness, to guard devotion. And for many years, she believed those walls were mercy. Inside, life moved by the sound of a bell. A bell decided when the day began, when it ended, when she spoke, when she knelt, when she ate. Choice was unnecessary. Obedience was everything. Silence wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. Words were measured, emotions contained. She learned early how to disappear, telling herself this was holiness. If she emptied herself of will, of preference, of longing, then God would fill the space left behind. And she was sincere. She loved God with the only framework she'd been given, believing sacrifice was the language heaven understood best. But deep inside, questions formed. Why does obedience feel so heavy? Why does peace feel so distant? She pushed them away. Questions were dangerous. So she swallowed them and prayed harder. Years passed, marked by ritual and repetition. She was surrounded by others, yet deeply alone. Joy was restrained, laughter quiet. She learned to love God in discipline, but not yet in freedom. And then came the dream. It was unmistakably clear. She was standing in an open space, no walls, no ceiling. The air felt alive. Light surrounded her, warm against her skin. And then God spoke, not through hierarchy, not through a command passed down by men. Directly, he called her by her name, the one spoken before vows, before she learned to disappear. And he said,
"Come out."
She woke with tears falling, her heart racing not with fear, but with recognition. The familiar walls of the convent suddenly felt suffocating. The silence, once comforting, now pressed against her chest. If she obeyed, she would lose everything she knew. If she did not, she would betray the very God she had given her life to serve. That morning, she moved through the convent differently. The bell's authority loosened. She prayed, but her prayers were urgent, trembling, alive. Lord, was that you? A steady peace answered her.
Yes.
Leaving was not dramatic. She folded her few belongings and walked toward the gate. Her hands trembled. When it opened, the sound echoed, and when it closed behind her, she did not look back. She stepped into a world she did not know, carrying nothing but obedience, fear, and a God she trusted more than certainty. The world did not welcome her gently. It moved at full speed, indifferent. The first thing she noticed was sound. Cars, horns, overlapping voices, laughter spilling from open doors. She stood still, overwhelmed. For the first time, she was responsible for choosing her own direction. Her clothing felt strange, lighter. Without the familiar garments of devotion, she felt unprotected, exposed. Who am I now? How will anyone know I belong to God? Fear followed her like a shadow. What if she had misunderstood? That night, sleep didn't come. The room felt too open. She missed certainty. She whispered into the dark, Lord, you called me, please. Don't leave me now. An answer didn't come in words, but a peace settled around her. Not the peace of understanding, but the peace of presence. Morning came without bells. The absence was startling. Time, once rigid, now belonged to her. The freedom felt heavier than chains. And slowly, she realized God was waiting for her. For the first time, prayer wasn't scheduled, it was chosen. She spoke honestly about her fear, her confusion, and something changed inside. She felt seen. The days that followed were not easy. She learned how to work, how to navigate casual conversations. She saw God present in places she'd been taught to avoid. Exhaustion crept in, not from physical labor, but from years of suppressed emotion finally breathing. She slept, but didn't feel restored. One evening, she finally asked, Lord, why am I so tired? The answer came as she opened the scriptures, not out of obligation, but desperation. Her eyes fell on a familiar passage that now felt new. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made. And he rested. She stopped. God rested. Not because he was weary, but because the work was finished. She read on. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. Blessed. Sanctified. She had been striving for holiness her whole life. She had never been taught how to rest in it. Rest, she realized, was not inactivity, it was trust. The first Sabbath she kept outside the convent felt uncertain. As Friday faded, she finished her work early. Not because she was told to, but because something inside her leaned toward a chosen obedience. As the sun set, she sat quietly, and then peace arrived. Time slowed. The pressure to perform faded. The Sabbath became a place where fear loosened its grip. Week by week, rest took root. She learned to delight gratefully. And in that rest, something unexpected happened. She began to heal. Healing didn't make her brave overnight. She was still careful with her heart. But obedience had taught her that when God leads, he also provides. It was on a gentle Sabbath morning that she felt a quiet pull. Go. She dressed simply and stepped outside, letting her feet choose the direction. She passed grand churches, loud churches, Her spirit recoiled from both. She kept walking. And then she heard it. Singing. Not polished or amplified. Just scripture woven gently into melody, inviting her in. The building was modest, unassuming. She stood at the threshold, heart pounding. Church had once meant control, hierarchy. She whispered, "Lord, if this is not where you want me, don't let me stay." She stepped inside. What struck her first was what she didn't feel. No pressure, no fear, no need to perform. People greeted one another warmly. There was reverence but not rigidity. She sat near the back as the word was read plainly, speaking for herself. When obedience was mentioned, it was spoken of as love, not control. When the Sabbath was referenced, it was cherished, not defended. Tears filled her eyes, not because she felt exposed, but because she felt safe. She returned the next Sabbath, and the one after. The longing arrived gradually. Faces became familiar. Conversations grew deeper. Faith wasn't measured by conformity, but by sincerity. She began to serve, not because she was assigned, but because she wanted to. She felt useful, not as a role, as herself. And somewhere in those ordinary Sabbaths, she noticed him. At first, it was just a faint awareness. He was often nearby, his presence calm without being distant. She noticed the way he prayed, with quiet attention. How he spoke to children as if their thoughts mattered. How he listened before responding. Their conversations began naturally, a comment after Bible study, a shared observation. He never rushed her words. He was simply present. That presence did something to her. Her shoulders lowered, her laughter came easier. The silence between them felt comfortable, not empty. It unsettled her. So she prayed, "Lord, guard my heart." And God didn't close it. Instead, he taught her how to open it safely. She spoke of leaving the convent, carefully, honestly. He didn't flinch or pity her. He honored her story. That mattered more than she could explain. One Sabbath afternoon, as they walked together, their hands brushed. It was accidental, and it was not. Her breath caught. She pulled her hand back, not from fear of him, but from fear of what she felt. A warmth spread through her chest, gentle and undeniable. That night, she prayed longer than usual. "Lord, I don't know what this is. If it's not from you, remove it." Peace came. Not the peace of denial, but the peace of permission. She didn't pursue him, nor did she withdraw. She waited. God was teaching her something new. Desire did not have to be dangerous. Affection did not have to steal obedience. Love, when ordered by God, didn't replace devotion. It flowed from it. She tried to be wise. That was the word she used in prayer, wise. Not guarded, not closed, not afraid. Just wise. She had learned the hard way what happens when devotion is shaped by fear, and she refused to swing into recklessness simply because affection had awakened in her heart. So she watched her heart. Carefully, she noticed how often she thought of him during the week. How certain scripture passages would instantly remind her of conversations they had shared. She noticed how Sabbath afternoons seemed so much brighter, so much warmer when she knew she would see him later. She didn't indulge these thoughts. She didn't let them run wild in her imagination. Instead, she brought them to God every single time. "Lord," she would pray, "you know me completely. You know how easily I surrender my heart. If this feeling, this affection, is not from you, please take it away." And every time she prayed that simple, honest prayer, God did not remove the feeling. Instead, He refined it. He deepened it. Their time together grew more profound naturally, without any pressure or forced conversations. The walks after Sabbath services grew longer, stretching into the late afternoon. Their conversations shifted, becoming more personal, less about abstract ideas and more about their actual lives. He started speaking about his own faith journey, the moments where obedience had cost him comfort, the seasons where God had led him through deep uncertainty, and what he truly believed it meant to love God's truth more than human tradition. She listened, her heart steady, her spirit attentive. This wasn't just a crush. This wasn't infatuation. It was something deeper. It was recognition. She saw in him a reflection of her own journey. She noticed how carefully he treated her story. He never asked for more than she willingly offered. He never pushed for details when she hesitated. When she spoke of her time in the convent, he listened with a kind of respect that felt incredibly rare. He wasn't just curious, and he certainly wasn't judgmental. He just saw her, not the title she once wore, not the sacrifice she had once made. She found herself laughing more freely than she had in years, smiling without restraint. Her body seemed to respond to his presence before her mind even had a chance to put up its usual cautions. She would find herself leaning slightly closer when he spoke, her shoulders relaxing when he reached for her hand. Holding his hand felt grounding, not like an electric shock that overwhelmed her senses. It was steady, it was safe. She realized one afternoon, as they walked beside each other beneath trees that were stirred gently by the wind, that she trusted him. And that single realization startled her far more than the affection ever could. Trust, for her, had once been something demanded of her, a requirement of her whole life. But this trust, this was chosen. This was hers to give. She began to wonder what it would be like to build a life with him. Not in a daydream or a fantasy, but in prayer. She imagined mornings where a scripture was read aloud between them, not assigned as a duty. She pictured evenings where the Sabbath arrived gently, welcomed together as a gift. A home where obedience to God was a shared journey, not an enforced rule. The thought felt both dangerous and incredibly holy. So she did what she had learned to do best. She waited. She didn't drop hints. She didn't try to rush things along. She placed every single step before God and refused to take one that he did not bless. And then, God spoke again. The dream came on a quiet night, without any warning. She was standing once more in that wide open space. The same divine light surrounded her, steady and alive. The same profound peace wrapped around her shoulders like a promise, but this time she was not alone. He was standing right beside her, not touching her, but not distant either. Simply present. And then God spoke, not in symbols, not indirectly. The words were crystal clear.
I, God, have chosen this man for you.
The words settled into her spirit with an authority and a gentleness that were perfectly intertwined. There was no confusion. No doubt rose up to challenge what she had heard. Chosen. She woke with tears streaming down her face, her heart racing not with fear, but with pure, unadulterated awe. God hadn't just led her out of her old life. He was actively leading her forward into a new one. From that night on, her anticipation changed. Hope began to bloom in her heart, a quiet, restrained, reverent hope. She didn't speak of the dream to anyone. She didn't rush toward the outcome she now knew was coming. She trusted the same God who had spoken to her once before to complete what he had so beautifully begun. Every Sabbath after that carried a new weight. Every glance between them felt more meaningful. Every moment of shared silence felt full and complete. She started to notice the way he looked at her. Now his gaze was longer, softer. She noticed how his thumb would brush gently against her hand when they held it, how his voice would lower just a little when he prayed beside her. Her heart began to long openly, but it was an obedient longing. She wondered how God would unfold the next step. In her quiet moments, she imagined him kneeling somewhere simple, somewhere prayed over, somewhere marked by sincere intention rather than public display. She didn't ask God when. She simply asked God to prepare her heart for it. And God answered not with a sense of impatience, but with an overwhelming peace. She sensed the shift before she fully understood it. It wasn't just intuition sharpened by anxiety or an imagination stirred by her longing. It was quieter than that, much deeper. It was a subtle awareness, a calm certainty that something God had been preparing was finally stepping into time. That Sabbath morning felt different from the moment she woke up. The light coming through her window seemed warmer, the air felt lighter. Her prayers were slower, more deliberate, as if her very spirit was leaning forward in expectation. She didn't try to put a name to the feeling. She simply carried it with her, placing him once again before God. "Lord," she whispered, "I trust you." They worshiped together that day, sitting a little closer than usual. She noticed how his hand often rested near hers on the seat, how his attention seemed both focused on the service and yet turned inward, as though he were holding something precious and fragile inside his chest. He prayed differently that morning, not louder, not longer, more anchored. When the scripture was read, his eyes didn't leave the page, but his whole posture carried a new sense of resolve. She felt her heart respond, a gentle tightening that made her breath just a little shallow. After the services ended, they walked as they often did. The path was familiar now, worn by many Sabbaths, marked by the very conversations that had reshaped her heart. Trees arched overhead, their leaves catching the sunlight in shifting patterns. The world seemed to move slowly around them, as if time itself had agreed to wait for this moment. He was quieter than usual, not distant, just intentional. She didn't feel the need to fill the silence. She had learned that silence, when shared, could speak volumes. They reached a place where the path widened slightly, a spot where they had lingered before, prayed before, laughed before. He stopped. She turned toward him. The way he looked at her made her heart ache in the most beautiful way. His eyes held certainty and tenderness intertwined, an affection that was deepened by a profound reverence. She saw no fear there at all, only a firm resolve that had clearly been shaped by prayer. He took both of her hands in his. The warmth of his touch grounded her instantly. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't impulsive. Every single step that had brought them to this exact place had been walked slowly, deliberately, under God's careful guidance. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Her heart pounded in her chest, but that unexplainable peace steadied her breath. "I have prayed," he continued, "for longer than you know. I asked God to guard us, to lead us, to close every single door that wasn't His." Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. "And every time I asked," he said, his voice soft but unwavering, "He led me back to you." She felt the weight of those words settle deep into her spirit. He released one of her hands and lowered himself to the ground. The entire world seemed to narrow to that single holy movement. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't rushed, it was sacred. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. She covered her mouth as tears spilled freely down her cheeks, the emotion rising too fast to contain. The sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears. He looked up at her, his eyes bright, unguarded, and filled with a love that asked for nothing and offered everything. "Will you walk with me for the rest of your life?" he asked. "Will you build a home with me grounded in truth, guided by God and shaped by love?" For a moment she couldn't speak. Joy surged through her like light breaking through clouds. This wasn't an escape from her past. This wasn't a replacement for what she lost. This was fulfillment. This was God Himself restoring what she had so freely surrendered to Him. She nodded, a laugh breaking through her tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, yes." When he stood and pulled her into his arms, she felt something settle completely inside her soul. This was what all that obedience had been leading her toward all along. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, comforting rhythm of his heart. The same peace that had followed her from the very first dream wrapped around her again, unmistakable and full. God had spoken, God had led, and God had kept His word. They didn't rush forward from that moment. They stood there and they prayed, together, thanking God not only for bringing them to this point, but for guarding them along the way, for teaching them patience, for ordering their love so that it didn't consume their obedience but flowed directly from it. That night, alone again, she knelt beside her bed. "Thank you," she whispered into the quiet of her room, "for seeing me, for leading me, for restoring what I laid down." She slept with a peace so deep it felt like the most profound rest after a very long journey. And she knew with every fiber of her being, this next chapter was not something she had taken for herself. It was something God had given. Marriage didn't come to replace her devotion to God. It came as His confirmation. On the day they stood together before Him, There was no sense of abandonment, no echo of the fear she once carried when obedience meant disappearing. There was only clarity. She knew without a single hesitation that she was not stepping away from God by stepping into marriage. She was stepping deeper into the very life He had prepared for her. They stood simply. There were no towering walls, no imposed silence, and no fear of doing something wrong. Their vows were recited to impress heaven, but spoken to honor it. Every single word was measured, deliberate, shaped by prayer and truth, not just tradition. She looked into his eyes and saw not authority over her, but faith beside her, strong, steady, and submitted to God rather than to control. When he took her hands, she felt the same peace she had felt the night God first spoke to her in a dream. The same stillness, the same certainty. This too was obedience. Marriage didn't silence her voice. It didn't diminish her calling or ask her to surrender herself again. Instead, it honored the person God had already shaped her to be. Their home came together slowly, intentionally. It wasn't extravagant, but it was alive. Windows were left open, letting light move freely through the rooms. Laughter found its place quickly, as if it had been waiting for permission to arrive. She learned that love could exist without constant supervision. That faith could be shared without a hierarchy. That obedience could be joyful. Sabbath became the heartbeat of their life together. Friday evenings softened the entire house. The frantic pace of the week slowed as the sun began to set. Candles were lit not out of obligation, but out of pure anticipation. Scripture was read aloud, not as an assignment, but as something cherished. Gratitude filled the very space where fear once lived. Rest was no longer lonely, it was shared. She would watch her husband pray and feel something inside her finally settle completely. His prayers were not loud or performative. They were sincere, rooted, and steady. He prayed with her, not over her. He walked with her, not ahead of her. And then, in time, the children came. Not as an expectation, but as a gift. Each child arrived carrying a joy she had never known how to even imagine. She held them close in the quiet hours, marveling at the warmth of their small bodies, the trust in their breathing, the way their presence filled spaces she once thought were meant to stay empty. Their laughter transformed the house. Their questions transformed her. Why do we rest on Sabbath? Why did God call you out? Why do we pray before the sun goes down? And she answered them honestly. She told them that obedience is not about fear. She told them that God speaks and listening truly matters. She told them that love, when it's ordered by God, never takes your freedom, it gives it. She sang Sabbath songs with them as the light faded on Friday evenings, watching them sway, clap, and smile without any restraint. She felt joy rise in her chest, not fleeting or guilty, but full and steady. She had once believed holiness requires silence. Now, she knew it could include laughter. She read scripture to them at bedtime, their small voices repeating words they were just beginning to understand. She prayed over them while they slept, her hands resting gently on their backs, gratitude overwhelming her. Every scraped knee, every bedtime prayer, every whispered mama, it all testified to God's faithfulness. Sometimes, when the house finally grew quiet, she would sit beside her husband and take his hand. They would speak softly about the day, about scripture, about how God had led them. And sometimes, words weren't even necessary. Peace spoke for them. She remembered the woman she had once been behind stone walls, faithful, sincere, obedient, yet so afraid. She didn't reject that woman. She honored her. And she thanked God for leading her further, for calling her out. There were moments, quiet, ordinary moments, when she would pause in the middle of her day and feel it all at once. Not overwhelmed, but fullness. She would be standing at the kitchen window, watching her children play in the yard, their laughter rising freely into the open air. Sunlight would catch in their hair as they ran, unburdened and safe, and her husband would move behind her, close enough that she felt his presence before she felt his touch. A hand at her waist, a kiss pressed gently against her temple. Nothing dramatic, everything sacred. In those moments, time seemed to fold in on itself. The memory of stone walls and silence felt distant, not erased, but redeemed. She could still remember the woman she had been, disciplined, faithful, longing without knowing why. That woman had not been wrong. She had simply been unfinished. Love, she learned, did not arrive all at once. It unfolded. Her marriage deepened with time, not through grand gestures, but through daily choosing. Choosing patience when exhaustion pressed in. Choosing prayer when misunderstanding threatened their closeness. Choosing tenderness when life demanded strength. They learned each other slowly. The way he reached for her hand when words failed. The way she leaned into him when worry crept in at night. The way silence between them no longer asked to be filled. Romance didn't fade, it matured. Their love carried memory now. Shared history, shared obedience. Sometimes, after the children were asleep, they would sit together beneath the quiet hum of evening. He would read scripture aloud, his voice steady and familiar. She would listen with her head resting against his shoulder, her fingers tracing patterns on his arm. Those moments were not rushed. They had learned the value of lingering. He would look down at her, then really look at her, and she would feel the same warmth she had felt the first time their hands brushed on that early Sabbath afternoon. Different now, deeper, anchored. She still remembered wishing he would propose, the anticipation, the prayerful ache. And now she lived inside the answer to that prayer. Their children grew in seasons. First steps that made her heart race. First words that made her laugh through tears. Questions that revealed how deeply faith was shaping them. They asked about God not with fear, but with curiosity. They asked about truth not because it was demanded, but because it was lived out before them. Friday evenings became holy celebrations. The house softened as the sun lowered. Work was set aside. Voices lowered naturally, not from a rule, but from reverence. Candles flickered gently as scripture was read and songs were sung. The children's voices were imperfect, enthusiastic, and sincere. She watched them, then her children, her husband, and sometimes her breath would catch in her throat. This was the life she had not known she was allowed to desire. She taught them that obedience is trust. She told them stories about listening to God, about courage, about how love sometimes asks you to walk away before it gives you something new. They listened wide-eyed, not fully understanding yet, but one day they would. And when that day came, she hoped they would remember this, that God is kind, that obedience leads to life, that love does not imprison, it frees. Years passed gently. The lines at the corners of her husband's eyes deepened with laughter. Her children grew taller, their voices changing, their independence stretching her heart in new ways. Through it all, God remained faithful, not dramatically, not loudly, but constantly. Sometimes she would wake in the early hours, the house still dark, and lie quietly beside her husband. She would listen to his breathing, steady and familiar, and feel gratitude rise unbidden. She had once slept in a silence filled with uncertainty. Now she slept in a peace shaped by love. She had once feared that leaving would mean loss. Now she understood that leaving had made room. Room for joy, room for partnership, room for children's laughter echoing through open rooms, room for a rest that did not require earning. Her life had become a testimony not of rebellion, but of alignment. God had not asked her to abandon devotion. He had invited her to deepen it. She had obeyed when it was costly. She had trusted when the future was hidden. She had waited when her heart longed. And God had answered not all at once, but perfectly. Sometimes, on quiet Sabbaths, she would sit alone for a moment while the others rested. She would close her eyes and remember the dream, the voice that had called her out into open space. She understood now. God had not been taking her away from holiness. He had been leading her home to it. She opened her eyes to the sound of her children calling her name, to the warmth of her husband's hand reaching for hers, to a life lived openly, in obedience, in love, in truth. She had obeyed God rather than man. And in doing so, she had finally come home. Thank you so much for joining me today. If this story resonated with you, I'd be so grateful if you like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. See you in the next one.